Warmly welcome to today's webinar, all of you. My name is Kristina Moberg. I'm the president of ESAC, the European Academy Science Advisory Council. ESAC is an association of the national science academies in the EU member states.
Nobody has really done a job on the attic though.
Plus Norway, Switzerland, and the UK, established in 2001 to enable academies to work together to give advice to European policymakers and provide collective voice of science in Europe. Through ESAC, the academies work together to compile scientific evidence of topics which are relevant to policymakers and, what is important, to provide independent, expert, evidence-based advice about scientific aspects of public policy to those who make and those who influence policy within the European institutions. For today, as you certainly know, scientific evidence is needed for so many political decisions. As a result of the membership of the European academies, ESAC has access to many of the best scientists in Europe to do its work. And what is important to note is that the views are completely independent of commercial and political interest, and that all processes are open and transparent. Through the academies, ESAC actually covers all scientific and technical disciplines, including even somewhat social sciences and humanities, but works mainly within three areas, which are energy, environment, and the biosciences. And in these areas, ESAC aims to deliver advice that's comprehensible, relevant, and timely. The final decisions which topics to work with are taken by Council, which is the General Assembly, where all member academies are represented. For each area, there is a steering panel headed by a panel director and a panel chair, and the work is done in working groups with most of the members from ESAC member academies. The scientific evidence and science advice are published in reports, which are freely accessible from the ESAC homepage. Today, we will hear about our latest report, Decarbonization of Buildings. But before I hand over to the Energy Panel Director, I would like to mention a couple of other reports. Today's reports can actually be seen as a kind of series of reports, which started with the decarbonization of transport in 2019, and a very recent commentary on decarbonization of the health sector, which was produced in collaboration with the Federation of European Academies of Medicine, FEAM. I would also like to mention a somewhat actually different type of report on the post-COVID-19 priorities, transformative changes needed for a sustainable future. You may recognize that the word transformative is also used in the European Green Deal. And finally, I would like to mention a report which will be presented tomorrow on international sharing of personal health data for research. The importance of sharing health data has been clearly recognized, not least recently during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this report, again, was produced in collaboration with FEAM and also with ALEA, which stands for All European Academies. But as I said, today we're here for a presentation of the report on decarbonization of buildings. And this is an important topic because buildings contribute to 25% of Europe's greenhouse gas emissions. As part of the Green Deal, and also to comply with the Paris Agreement, the EU is committed to reducing all greenhouse gas emission by 55% by 2030 as compared to 1990. So in this respect, emissions from buildings are important. And the indoor climate is also important, not least for our health, because we spend a large part of our lives in buildings. So the decarbonization of buildings is indeed a challenge, but also an opportunity. And this is what we will learn more about today. So it's my pleasure to hand over to the director of the ESAC Energy Program, Dr. William Gillard. But first, some technical remarks. Please, Johanna.
Thank you, Christina. I will share my screen quickly. Before we start with the webinar, just some very few technical remarks for the audience so you get the most out of this webinar. Please use the chat only for technical or administrative questions. If something isn't working right, you cannot see something, please put this in the chat. Then, since this is a webinar, unfortunately, we cannot see or hear you, but we strongly invite you to participate through the Q&A tool, which you can see in the lower half of your screen. You can there ask any questions that may arise during the presentations in the first half, or also to the panelists in the second half. Please feel free to post any questions there at any time. You can also comment on questions that other people have raised or post any publications of interest there. You can also upvote questions if you think that something that someone else has asked is important and really should get addressed in the panel discussion. If you're using Twitter or any other social media, we invite you to continue the discussion also on these platforms using our ESAC hashtag #ItScience, or also tagging us ESAC News. You're welcome to do that. Lastly, we would like to know a little bit more about you. Because we cannot see you, we prepared a short survey, which we would like to ask you to fill in, just so we have a better feeling of who is in the audience. And for the first question, we just put up a map here so you know what this is referring to. So the votes are coming in. I'll wait a bit more. Okay. So not everyone has voted yet, but I think I will close the poll now so we can move on, just to also show you the results. So we have the majority coming, or not the majority, but a large part coming from Western Europe, also many from Brussels joining us today, but also other parts of Europe are fairly well represented, and even people joining us from outside Europe. But around half of the people who replied to this poll are from academia, but we also have a lot of people from the building sector and also European institutions and national governments. So I think this looks promising to be a very diverse and interesting panel discussion. And with that, I would like to hand over to Wim van Zaarloos.
Good afternoon, I'm Wim van Zaarloos. I'm the chair of the Energy Steering Panel, which is overseeing our energy program. I will also act here as moderator, and I would like to mention that I'll keep the introduction of the speakers short since we have little time, but we will put the link to a profile of all the speakers in the chat in a few moments so that you can easily download a little document which has more of a background on the speakers. And with that, I would like to invite Bill Gillard to take the floor and tell us about the background of the report and the main messages from ESAC.
Okay, so good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or good afternoon to those who are in other time zones. Thank you very much for joining us. My presentation will outline the background to the project, the main messages for policymakers. Sorry, it seems to have gone already to here. Okay. And following my presentation, Brian Norton will go into more detail on the science which lies behind ESAC's messages. So ESAC's aim is to provide independent science-based advice for policymakers. So it's very important that we engage with the stakeholders who influence those policymakers. And it's great to see so many of you here. Our working group, which produced the report, had 19 members from 17 countries with a very broad spectrum of skills. We had architects, building physicists, social scientists, health experts, and many more. And the group worked entirely by Zoom and email. The report was reviewed by 13 independent peer reviewers who were nominated by their academies, not of course members of the working group. And the report has now been endorsed by ESAC's 28 national science academies who are members of ESAC. The project began just over 1 year ago in the spring of 2020 and was kicked off in a virtual workshop with presentations from 11 policy experts, including 7 from the European Commission itself. The working group had 4 meetings and subgroup meetings, and apart from that, the work was done essentially by email. The experts in the working group looked at the EU's commitments to decarbonisation, including the Paris Agreement and the EU climate law goal to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. They reviewed the recent and planned EU policies and regulations and strategies, notably those which are being strengthened through the Green Deal, including, of course, the renovation wave and energy sector integration, and the proposed revisions to the energy and climate directives, the energy performance of buildings, the renewables directive, energy efficiency, emission trading system, the effort sharing regulation, and of course the land use change and forestry. I'll come to that a little bit later. They also considered the governance and taxonomy regulations and the EU funding instruments. The working group reflected in particular on the IPCC 1.5 degree report from 2018 and its message that we have only 10 years to decarbonize if we're going to limit climate warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius in line with the Paris Agreement. It quickly became clear that there's no silver bullet solution for decarbonization of buildings. It will require the rapid phasing out of fossil fuels together with rapid deployment of much more renewable energy supplies. It will also require rapid acceleration of building renovations. And to deliver that acceleration, the EU building industry must be modernized. This could create, we estimate, about 3 million more jobs, including high quality jobs for a workforce with a much better gender balance, especially if more emphasis is given to the prefabrication of building components. Massive investments are urgently needed to deliver greenhouse gas emission reductions. Fossil fuel subsidies must be stopped and replaced with funding for renewable electricity generation, electricity grid reinforcement, and very importantly, district heating. Stranded assets can be avoided by focusing on long-term needs, not on infrastructure that will soon become redundant. For example, the gas networks that we use today for most of the heating in buildings in Europe. Carbon sinks should be increased and forestry supported, for example, by using timber in buildings where the carbon will remain for decades. Wood from whole trees with long carbon payback periods must not be burnt for energy production. Bioenergy should only be produced from forestry biomass residues and wastes. Public funding, grants, and incentives should be used to trigger and de-risk. Have I gone too far? Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Public funding, grants, and incentives should be used to trigger and de-risk private investments in deep renovations. Most of the costs of renovations will have to be financed by private investments. Renovations, I've got this slide system is not doing what I want it to do. Sorry. Yeah. Energy efficient. So that was, sorry, this was the biomass. Yeah, this is the one I was looking for. Public funding, grants and incentives should be used to trigger and de-risk private investments in deep renovations. Most of the costs will have to be financed by private investments. But renovations offer a good way to address energy poverty, much better than using public money to pay for high fuel bills of low-income families. Energy efficient renovations also improve the health and well-being of building occupants. They raise the quality of life of whole neighborhoods and therefore the value of its buildings. Good examples of these can be found amongst the projects which have received project development assistance from the European Investment Bank's ELENA scheme. The experts concluded that the current policies are not sufficient to deliver the EU's emission reduction targets for the following main reasons. 25% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from building operation, all the EU emissions. So to focus on renovation by 2050, late. Renovation rates of around 1% today, which is what our current policies are delivering, is too low. We need to double, in some countries, triple them. We need to phase out fossil fuels. And there seems to be a missing plan at the moment for the phasing out of gas, which is going to be a tough question. The deployment of low carbon electricity generation is very slow. We need faster. Competition for green electricity between buildings, industry, and transport will have to be better integrated and governed. And embodied greenhouse gas emissions in building materials and components for new buildings and for renovations have been largely ignored. The cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, including operating and embodied emissions from buildings, must be regulated. We shoot ourselves in the foot if we create more emissions by manufacturing construction materials over the next 10 years than we save by making existing buildings more energy efficient. Carbon capture and storage has the potential to permit continuing use of natural gas, which may be necessary in some member states. At least during the transition, this might be an option to the transition to a fully decarbonized energy system. So progress with carbon capture and storage needs to be faster. So in conclusion, we have 9 key messages for policymakers coming out of this report. The phasing out of fossil fuels by 2030 to increase the integrated supplies of decarbonized electricity and heat to buildings, industry, and transport. And we need to accelerate the deployment of CCS. We need to use grants and incentives to trigger, leverage, and de-risk private financing. We need to regulate the levels of embodied greenhouse gas emissions. This is an issue which we have emphasized quite a bit in the report, in both building materials and components. We also need to use more recycled materials to reuse existing building components. The mantra should be renovate, don't demolish. We need to refocus the building regulations, the certification schemes, and the incentives to deliver new and renovative buildings that operate with nearly zero greenhouse gas emissions. We've been talking for years about nearly zero energy buildings. We need to be looking these days at nearly zero greenhouse gas emission buildings. The health and well-being we advise to be a driver, to promote this as a driver for the tripling or doubling of the renovation rates, because by good energy efficient renovation, we improve the air quality, increase the access to daylight, reduce drafts, reduce or avoid overheating. All these come together if we do a good building renovation. Cities and local authorities have a key role to play, and we need to facilitate and support their commitments to decarbonising the buildings over which they are responsible. And at the same time, to look at how they can help with the reduction of energy poverty. This is a crucial issue, especially for the residential buildings. We need to expand and modernise the building industry to operate using circular economy type business models, with 3 million more jobs to deliver new and renovated buildings with nearly zero greenhouse gas emissions. We need to improve the access for building owners and professionals to certified data on the embodied greenhouse gas emissions of building materials and components, and on the energy and greenhouse gas emission performance of new and renovated buildings. Data on building performance is still not widely enough available. And particularly thinking about the European policymakers, we need to update our legislation, much of which is currently going through, of course, a review and potential updating process. And it needs to be done with an integrated approach to phase out fossil fuels, increase renewable energy supplies, and reduce the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. We need courageous policymakers who will listen to the science and then convince the citizens of Europe, the investors, the building owners, that the side effects of the renovation vaccine are much less painful than the impacts of climate warming. What is ESAC going to do next? Our next steps are to discuss how to accelerate this decarbonisation process with EU policymakers, stakeholders, NGOs, and other opinion formers, and at a national level through our member academies to work with the country governments. And within ESAC, we will be performing some follow-up work on specific topics which have emerged during this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. Let's go right away to the chair of the working group that wrote this report, Brian Norton. Brian is the head of the Energy Research Tyndall National Institute at the University of Cork and professor of solar energy applications at the Technological University in Dublin. Brian, can I invite you to take the floor?
Thank you very much, Wim. Can I start by thanking both Wim and Bill for their huge contributions to this study. And at the end, I'll list the group that put together this study, a very distinguished group of colleagues. So first of all, why is energy in buildings important? Well, buildings produce some 25% of total EU greenhouse gas emissions. About 2/3 of those emissions come from residential buildings and 1/3 from non-residential. And half of those emissions are produced directly by the combustion of fossil fuels, and the other half coming from consuming electricity or district heating that has not come from decarbonized sources. So this is the operational energy of buildings, the energy that's used for heating, cooling, lighting, and working appliances. However, as Bill has said, there's a lot more energy in buildings than just that. And there is, as well as the operational phase in the middle of this diagram here, you've got embodied greenhouse gas emissions in the extraction, the processing, and the transport of the materials that make up buildings, the building components, etc. And those are quite significant. Typically, maybe half the energy in a building over its life cycle might be in the embodied energy in the materials that make up the building. So one of the key things then is actually getting information on embodied energy. And this is complicated because whilst, as Bill has said, one could use wood, and assuming there isn't waste in the production processes around wood, which would lock in CO2 emissions. You could also use recycled materials. So knowing whether your steel is newly produced or recycled becomes important. So having a very strong access to data on embodied emissions is a key part of taking low energy buildings forward. And also because the performance certification of buildings in Europe at present tends to focus entirely around the operational energy, bringing the embodied energy into the consideration of how buildings actually perform is very important. Now, obviously, in selection materials, it's not just their embodied energy. There's a whole range of other requirements in terms of the strength, stiffness, insulation properties, fire safety, etc., which needs to be considered. In terms of the final energy consumption in buildings at present in Europe, the biggest application is space heating, and that demand can be reduced by renovating existing buildings. The demand for cooling is growing, and that might be a reflection perhaps of low energy design, which is producing overheating in buildings. And there are other demands, but they're not really changed by a movement from current fossil fuel resources to low carbon sources. So space heating is the big key application that needs to be applied in terms of the operational energy use of buildings. In terms of the final energy consumption by residential sector by fuel type, the key thing here is that phasing out of fossil fuels have a big impact on how we heat buildings. Gas for heating dominates today, but most energy demands in buildings could be supplied either by electricity or directly by renewable heat. So what can we do to reduce the energy consumption? Well, first of all, improve the building envelope and its services. Insulate the building envelope, install energy efficient lighting, draft proof the envelope to reduce infiltration loss, improve ventilation control, but ensure you've got heat recovery from the air that is leaving the building. Improving high performance windows, doors, and perhaps larger windows with much lower heat loss coefficients that allow much more daylight into the building, which is both good for health, but also displaces artificial lighting. Reducing cooling demand by ensuring that we've got shading systems to avoid overheating from high sun angles, and also very much more efficient control of heating systems using energy management systems of various kinds. So a whole lot of measures can be done at the level of the building itself. You can also do things at the supply side. So as well as reducing the energy consumption in buildings, there's a whole range of things on the supply side. So using renewable electricity for heat pumps, together with heat electricity storage in battery, which those batteries could be stationary, or they could indeed be in future in electric vehicles, and we'll come to sector coupling, which that implies later on. Use solar water heating, and it has very strong adoption in particular parts of Europe at present, but also using solar and or geothermal for solar space heating and cooling. Biogas where available, although hydrogen is unlikely to be economically viable for space heating, because certainly green hydrogen, for example, is always going to be more expensive than the green electricity used to produce it. And so it's obviously rather better to use that green electricity as the mechanism in buildings rather than hydrogen. District heating is in some parts of Europe is very prevalent and can be supplied by renewables, including heat pumps, solar, excess renewable energy, and waste heat, and will need to be in future. And one can install photovoltaics on the roof and meet self-consumption demands within the building, okay, so that the occupants of a building no longer are simply the consumers of energy, particularly the consumers of electricity, but become producers as well. So the idea of them becoming prosumers. Now, I'll come back to this a little later on, because the key thing is that the installation of PV and other energy generating systems aren't used as perhaps an excuse for not actually reducing the underlying energy consumption, but I'll come back to that a little later. linked to all of this is that the energy system is changing overall. It's moved from dominated by centralized supply side of electricity and gas towards much more distributed generation. And much more storage, both within the buildings in terms of electricity and heating batteries, but also storage of electricity, particularly in electric vehicles. Though you look at the interactions between that and district heating systems and their decarbonisation, you're seeing much more intersector coupling, which this diagram attempts to represent. And so it's important that when looking at energy policies in the building sector, they're integrated with similar policies for transport, industry, and the overall energy sector, so that one's getting an overall reduction in the CO2 emissions and not looking at suboptimal solutions. As going back to the embodied emissions, one of the interesting things about renovation is that it will reduce the operational energy use of buildings very significantly, but requires energy to do it. It requires energy, obviously, in the production processes of the renovated building, but there is embodied energy in the new materials used. And that embodied energy effectively has a payback period until the renovated building actually has a net decrease in its overall emissions. So you've got a period of increased climate warming for deep renovation. And important to bring that into the overall calculations when working out the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. And indeed, and there are a number of tools becoming available, making sure that one is making materials choices. There are materials that can have the same performance in terms of reduction in operational energy use, but would have quite different performance in terms of embodied energy, that the appropriate materials are selected from a holistic perspective of both operating and embodied emissions. Taking all this together, and Bill mentioned this, if you look at trying to look at the fair share that greenhouse gas reductions by 2040 with buildings to meet the kind of targets established in terms of global warming mitigation, need to achieve a renovation rate of about 3% a year in Europe. It's 1% at present. So renovation rates need to very significantly improve. If they don't, the calculations show, as shown in this graph, that the limits on global warming will be far exceeded. So the business as usual scenario is not tenable, and a very substantial increase in renovation rates is required to achieve the required cumulative reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. Challenging all of this is how to finance this, and part of this actually is also that there's a reconstruction of the renovation industry in terms of its logistics, its supply chain, more offsite construction, etc. So the cost is reduced, but also then that the costs are met by a whole range of different mechanisms illustrated in this diagram, largely dependent on to what extent there is a private gain, a private good, and a public policy gain and a public good. And there's a mixture of those in all of these things, that the individuals who are in the dwelling will receive a reduction in their energy use and contribute to reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions. But governments, government agencies are also achieving their policy goals in terms of the global reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a mixture of public and private good here, and that's reflected in the financing options that are available. Also, though, it should be very, very important that very much the elephant in the room, represented very figuratively in this diagram by an elephant, is fuel poverty. In some parts of Europe, this is a very considerable problem, and one can have as many financing options as available, but simply they're not available to people in fuel poverty. So interventions that address fuel poverty are critical as part of the overall renovation strategy, and that needs to take account of what the tenure of particular residential buildings is, what can be done in social housing, for example, may be more positive than what may be able to be done perhaps for owner occupiers, or perhaps in those of privately rented accommodation. So all the complexity and nuance of this needs to be taken into account. So, as I've said, one of the key challenges in all of this is actually the expansion and modernization of the European Union's building industry. guiding the industry to operate using circular business models that create more and higher quality jobs, deliver new and renovated buildings with higher construction standards and lower greenhouse gas emissions. The proposed renovation wave could create more than 3 million new jobs, but it requires seeing the renovation sector as a coherent industrial sector. And this has many aspects from, for example, how buildings are surveyed and offering perhaps fixed prices for renovations, and where the risk sharing perhaps is less on the client and more on the contractor. Much more use of prefabrication that enable much more quality control, costs, etc. Much tighter logistics and supply chain, and indeed linking that in with how renovation is financed. And all of this needs considerable work on training and skills development, and which is itself a huge challenge across Europe. But nevertheless, one sees optimistic seeds of these developments, but it needs to be carried through in the industry having the courage to take on this as a new sector and a new opportunity. As Bill said earlier on, moving towards near zero energy buildings is not as simple as it seems. The NZEB idea, the near zero energy buildings idea, is meaningless to homeowners. It's couched in terms of primary energy rather than actually the delivered energy that the homeowner sees. And it would be better to focus on the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. It could also lead, as I mentioned earlier on, to some perverse incentives in that you might export PV electricity in the summer to offset imported fossil fuels in winter. And this can have the effect, if that's encouraged, of discouraging the actual reduction in the underlying energy use in the building. So in terms of how regulations are couched, in terms of what's incentivized, it's important that the calculation schemes take out of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions and are very clearly related to the actual energy use in the building. And that's heavily determined by factors such as occupancy. So for example, you can see in the diagram here that the calculated energy consumption is higher than actual in poor buildings and lower than actual in good buildings. And this largely arises from user behavior, because the calculated consumption here, which are done by energy rating mechanisms, and the energy rating in buildings, the cumulative energy ratings of building stock is what's used to calculate both the energy use in buildings in particular jurisdictions, and also the potential savings energy use by renovating, say, take this diagram, from building that is rated G to a building that's rated A. Unfortunately, a rating which is, again, as I said, of standard conditions, doesn't reflect the actual conditions in the buildings, and this can be seen clearly here. Moreover, when you look at that overall, and you look at the energy ratings, you look at the energy consumption by rating, it is clear that that the issues in terms of using energy ratings are considerable, and performance should therefore be presented as in a typical range and before and after renovations, because building energy ratings are only a reference conditions, and there'll be a huge range of performance around that due to how ratings work, due to how the occupancy of buildings actually happens, and due to many other factors that are going to influence the calculation procedures. So taking these with a dose of salt and anchoring them in real actual measurements is critically important. So to bring to some conclusions, and my discussion here has only touched on some of the issues that are in the report, and we encourage everyone to read the report very thoroughly, which goes into a lot more detail on what we presented here, and indeed cites a lot of the relevant literature in terms of backing up these conclusions. There is no silver bullet for decarbonising buildings. There's got to be both a reduction in the energy use and CO2 emissions from buildings in their operation, a reduction in greenhouse gas and CO2 emissions in the materials used to make buildings, and a decarbonisation of the energy supplies, either electricity or from district heatings to buildings. And there are complex interactions with other sectors. Fundamentally, one needs to phase out fossil fuels and supply more renewable electricity and decarbonize the district heating systems. There's a need to reduce energy needs of buildings so that they can be supplied largely by renewable energy in an integrated system together with the transport and energy sectors. And as I've said, reducing the embodied CO2 emissions of building materials, components and processes. There's huge opportunities to create jobs by increasing the building workforce by 3 million and modernize its ways of working, and huge opportunities to promote investment in building renovation that improve the health and well-being of building users, as well as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that actually is a particularly important point, that buildings exist as a place for comfort and amenity and health of their occupants. And that can be improved at the same time as reducing the emissions from the buildings. And then important to use grants, incentives, long-term low interest rate loans in collaboration with financial institutions to triple the rate of building renovations from what it is at present. Now, this activity was, as I said, done by a large group of colleagues who are named on this list. I won't go down through the entire list, but I'd like to thank everyone on this list for bringing a diverse range of perspectives, experience and insight to the work of the group, and again like to thank them for their commitment to the project over some 18 months. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thanks for the presentation of the report, and Bill for the introduction. There have already been a few questions being asked in the Q&A. If you want to pick those up, then feel free to do so. I will certainly bring up some of the questions later after the panel members have given their response. Indeed, we feel very honored that 8 leaders from various sectors and various organizations have accepted our invitation to give a first response to this report at this meeting. And I would like to go to that section right away, and then after that we will have the panel discussion with these members. So I'd like to ask to invite Kieran Cuff, member of the European Parliament, to take the floor. Kieran is the president of EUFIORIS, the European Forum for Renewable Energy Sources. He's a member of the European Parliament from Ireland, and within Ireland he has also been the Minister of State for Climate Change, Sustainable Travel and Planning. Kieran.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be with you today. As an architect and an urban planner, as well as being an MEP, it's really interesting to get the insights from this report. And thanks to Christina for the invitation from Jacek. And in listening to the presentations so far, William, can I just congratulate you on a brilliant report, and in just going quickly through the 75 pages to incorporate the Danish pyramid of building materials, and also that table of NZEB and how it's applied and the minimum standards around Europe. I found both of those graphics really interesting. I mean, I can see they're being referenced in the chat, and obviously there's caveats with any of this, but it's a hugely useful report. And thanks to Brian for mentioning the elephant in the room of energy poverty. I'm sure my colleague in Brussels, Sorka Edwards, will reference that later on. But if we want to ensure a just transition, we have to improve the building performance of the homes of those least equipped to heat and cool their dwellings. If we're not doing that, we're not really tackling the social side of the climate crisis. Back to Brussels. Later this year, the Commission will launch the revision of the Energy Performance in Buildings Directives and the Energy Efficiency Directives to bring them in line with our 2030 and 2050 climate obligations. And this bundle, the Fit for 55 or Fit for 2030 package, is a real opportunity for Europe to develop regulations that make our homes less energy intensive and safer for our citizens. We've all spent so much time indoors during the pandemic, and we realize the importance of healthy and comfortable homes and buildings. I'm pleased that we're talking about revisiting the figures every 5 years instead of 10 years. A legislative term in the European Parliament is only 5 years, and 10 years can feel like a lifetime in terms of policy makers in Brussels. I think the Chinese have the right idea when they put together their 5-year plans. It concentrates the mind and forces us to ensure that we deliver real changes within short policy windows. But I do think the European Union needs to step up the decarbonisation of heating and cooling. And I think now is the time to completely phase out fossil fuels for heating as a step towards 100% renewable energy systems. And we do need to replace old gas boilers with modern heat pumps. We certainly shouldn't be putting in new gas boilers at this time. And we can use European funds to subsidize schemes for this replacement where appropriate. But as other speakers have pointed out, the skills gap is a hugely important challenge. And we need a crash course to bring our craftspeople up to speed with the new technologies that are out there. We can't go on with business as usual. And of course, the decarbonisation of our buildings has to be done with tenants' interests in mind. The occupiers need to be at the heart of this transformation. And any legislative revisions at a European level must be environmentally and socially just. They need to be user-friendly, easy to use, and social housing should certainly be at the forefront of this transformation. Last year, I wrote a report on maximizing the energy efficiency of the European Union building stock, and I advocated for a neighborhood approach when it comes to renovations and housing. So this should be the basis of developing renovation projects across Europe. It means support and funding to local authorities. And I can see log jams, I can see bottlenecks on the skills side, but also local authorities we need to build capacity there so that they can rise to the challenge. And I think the bottom-up approach has been proven to work well, and it's something we should set as a standard across the European Union. If we wanted to get to this doubling of renovations per year, it'll involve 2% or 3% of GDP, and that is quite a challenge. But looking to the decade ahead, we have to ensure our buildings are healthy, safe, and secure for both citizens and the environment. I think we can deliver this level of ambition. That's what the European Green Deal is all about. And that's what I was talking about with the renovation wave. And as you can see, young people are demanding more. The court cases in the Netherlands and in Germany are showing that the people are ahead of the politicians when it comes to this. I'll be working on the European Building Performance Directive over the year ahead. I think we can deliver. It will require buy-in from all political shades within the European Parliament and institutions, but I think there's huge enthusiasm for this in the outside world, and hopefully within the Brussels bubble, we can deliver. Thank you.
Thanks, Kieran, for your wonderful contribution. Let me move on right away and invite Stephen Moser to take the screen. Stephen is at DG Energy from the European Commission and is there the head of the unit for buildings and products. Stephen.
Thank you very much, Wim, and also congratulations from my side to William and all the researchers having worked, and thank you for the kind invitation, and I'm very happy to be with you. I'm very impressed by the work done. I would say that I fully agree with the conclusions that about the key messages, what will have to be done. We need, and as Kieran has pointed out as well, we need to think big here. I think we have a similar vision across the European Parliament and the Commission. We have also drawn very carefully on the European Parliament's report, which Kieran steered last year. We need to really jump forward. This will only work if basically we think also about the whole range of advantages from building renovations in order to actually achieve a more than doubling, some people say tripling of renovation rates and deepening renovations. Citizens will be ready to engage in renovations if they feel that this is really serving our collective and individual well-being and produces benefits. And there can be really overlapping synergies across various policy aims, not just climate, energy, but also health, safety, accessibility, and social inclusion, affordability, addressing energy poverty, which was rightly so, and I couldn't agree more, presented as the elephant in the room. It is the elephant in the room, the social question, but it goes beyond that. It goes towards affordability for those with a kind of medium income. Even in the more expensive cities, there's a strong public goods character. It's a mixed good. There are individual benefits, but also society-wide public benefits from renovations, notably through better social inclusion, safety, but of course also the climate policy agenda, and the broader integration of the energy system across sectors, including the transport sector, which justify fully a massive investment from public sources. And this has been one of the major obstacles in the past, that actually public benefits have not been fully addressed, and often the renovations were not carried out due to the split incentives question, for instance, because of course the individual actors act also rationally from their side, and will go as far as they think it's good for them, but not necessarily go further. And that's why we now need to use the massive funding available from recovery facilities and the cohesion policy funds under the multi-annual financial framework, and use them to the fullest, together of course with private financing, which should be triggered and further increased by the various programs and facilities which exist, including InvestEU and all the efforts by the European Investment Bank, and also national promotional public banks and state aid on the national level, which will be absolutely necessary to have smart design of state aid schemes. What Kieran mentioned is I think also key, is to look for higher aggregation, neighborhood approaches, district approaches. We need to help citizens to firstly identify what should be the aim of renovations, the scope, and this often works much better and is more effective if you think across similar types of buildings in a neighborhood. You can also then better connect to the transport system, integrate renewable energy, which is locally produced, but also green the cities, and have a vision also for the inhabitants of a certain neighborhood, how they want to live, and then of course the links to safety, accessibility, that is also very usefully addressed on a district and neighborhood level. The key thing is to bring down costs. It was mentioned we need to industrialize, we need to professionalize also. That can also be better done at the neighborhood level. We need expert advice coming in. Many people simply don't know. They have the best will in the world, but they don't know how to do it. They don't have the time to do it. So it has to be professionalized. The costs can be shared out, and also the obstacles which are often identified and hinder renovations, like small volumes, planning permissions, and all that. is easier if it's at larger volumes, and that of course should not lead to a uniform look, but rather a strategic reflection. How do we bring forward a certain neighborhood, a certain district, and will also assign a huge responsibility and role to the political actors at the municipal local level to steer and facilitate and bring forward these discussions. And of course, from the EU side, we have to promote good practices. We have to provide direction through legislation. We are now in the preparation of the impact assessment and the public consultation and stakeholder consultation of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. And in July, there will also already be the revision proposals for the Energy Efficiency Directive and Renewables Directive and the Emissions Trading Scheme and several other pieces of legislation, which will also have an influence and a crucial role for buildings. So this is the picture which we are currently working on, and try really to promote the good cooperation amongst all actors. So I thank you very much for this, and we take very good note of this report for our further work.
Thanks very much, Stefan. You mentioned in the last part also financial aspects, and that brings us naturally to Ralph Goldman from the European Investment Bank. He is currently the head of the Energy Efficiency and Energy Advisory Division. Ralph, may I invite you to take the floor?
Well, good morning, good afternoon. Many thanks for the invitation from ESAC, and my congratulations to Bill and Brian and the teams involved on the excellent report, which I had the pleasure to read over the last weekend already, and I was really interested in that. Before starting commenting on the report, some words, because probably in this setup the EIB is not that well known to the audience. So who is the EIB? We are the public, we are the EU bank, which is owned and governed by the 27 member states. So we are a public bank based here in Luxembourg. And we do something like around 70 billion euro of finance every year. So 2 years ago, we published our energy lending policy, which clearly calls for energy efficiency first and has a strong focus on buildings. So this report is pretty pertinent to our business, especially in these times where we have just issued our climate bank roadmap, which was approved by our board, which calls also for all our activities to be Paris aligned. But probably more importantly, that 50% of EIB lending should go to climate and environment projects, where the other 50% at least have to be Paris aligned, so do not significant harm if we use the speak of the taxonomy. What have we done in the past? We do around about 5 billion euro per year on energy efficiency, where about 80% of that is related to buildings, which is renovation and new build. Significant, and I promise you a lot of work here, but draft against what you also mentioned in the report on the overall financing needs, which basically is, well, several times higher than what a public bank or even all public banks inside the union together could bring. We also do TA, which has been mentioned also by Bill, and which is kindly financed by the Commission, and which we will continue as well. Coming to the report, many thanks for these really detailed analysis, and we broadly agree with the analysis. Just to highlight some points, we definitely agree with having a focus on final energy consumption in all the data we have, because that's basically where we look at the buildings, and which is also importantly for looking this from a bank's perspective, because this is actually where tenants, homeowners, and also public administration will base their investment decision on, because it's the final energy they're paying. It's what they consume in the building. Which brings me to the second point, where I'm a little bit more critical. I fully acknowledge the theoretical concept of the embodied emissions, which I think is utterly important. But the question is, how is that dealt with? Is that something which is to be on the individual level? You propose to have this highlighted also to the in the energy performance certificates, But probably this is more for the role of regulation. So basically regulating the embodied energy content in the building material. And I will explain also why. As I said before, the investment decision is usually taken on what is the operational emissions. People have already paid for their house. They don't care about the embodied emissions. Some care, but it will not affect really the investment decision if we're talking large scale. So we have to be careful that this is tackled in regulation and probably not brought also to the financial sector, as we can see a little bit in the taxonomy, where banks probably are not prepared. And we're working a lot with intermediate banks because the projects are small and dispersed. So we have to work with intermediate banks. And there you already see they have hard times to gather even the operational energy data. Banks are probably not the best place where this can be done. So this is a strong call as we are policy taker that this is probably dealt in regulation. A short remark on the grants. Basically, yes, you mentioned where grants could be used for, but we also see the need for grants to make the investment decision. So you need grants to well, subsidize the real investment, but you also need grants to develop the project. So you mentioned municipalities, a buzzword nowadays is one-stop shop, so we can talk long about this one. But talking about grants, and grants will never be sufficient to reach the investment volume. But what we also see also with the amount of grants being available and the focus on absorption, we see relatively high grant rates, which do not allow for private sector or even public sector banks to co-finance alongside grants. So that is one part which also needs to be highlighted, that the modulation of that grant is commensurate to the problem or to the hurdle we want to overcome, let it be payback times or not taking up investments, but it should not crowd out financing in any form or shape. One critical remark to the report, which is close to my heart, as you can see from the speaker profile, I'm an engineer by training. What could be added in any future report is a little bit more on social aspects and behavioral economics, because also in the proposal you say, well, availability of grants or the convincing argument may be the well-being, the health benefits. However, I'll come to those.
Ralph, if I may, your line seems to be rather bad. At least here it's pretty low on my end.
Yeah. Well, I hope it's getting better.
I think this is better.
Okay. Okay. So what we need to have is also a reflection. Why are people not renovating, and how can we, in other words, nudge them to the renovation? So that part of the scientific analysis could be added to the report, because that's one of the main problems we see, that how to bring people and what does people love from doing that, and what are the right arguments to do so. I stop here, and I hope the connection was not too bad. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ralph, for your contribution. These are certainly issues that we will come back to later, and certainly in the first part of your talk, the line was fine. Let me move on to Paolo Bertoldi from the European Commission GRC, the Joint Research Center, where Paolo is in charge of the activities for energy efficiency policy, the efficient use of electricity, and innovative policy instruments. Paolo, please welcome here and please take the floor.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this very good report that you prepare. It's very interesting and rich of data and information, and I fully subscribe the conclusion. I want us to focus on a few elements. First of all, we need the refurbishment or renovation of existing building, and we should aim for deep renovation. We should not avoid lock-in with a shallow renovation. But the problem is that we always think that the end user is a rational, take rational decision, and while the renovation journey is very complex, we have more to understand his behavior, his question, his doubt that he has, his priorities. Otherwise, we will flood with money, have policy, but renovation do not take place. We know that there are barriers, like the payback time is very long. It disrupts the life in the buildings. If you have insulation, refurbishment of all the technical system, sometimes you have even to leave the buildings for a few months. there is mistrust on the result. Will the claim save materialize? We know there is always a rebound. For example, household in fuel poor household, energy poor, which are underheating, they will heat up to a decent level. So the energy savings most probably are not there, but still is worth renewing these buildings. So the household needs information, support, going beyond the financial support. And they already mentioned, for example, the one-stop shops that are popping up in different cities and regions in Europe. They can help the household or the building owner to understand the journey, help them to select good contractor, to have quality assurance, to arrange the finance, and to guarantee sometimes the results. Sometimes this is done by one-stop shop, sometimes by ESCOs under EPC, mainly for non-residential buildings. Another important point is the finance has been already touched upon by Ralph and other speakers before me. I agree entirely that we need to have a more private sector financing. Public support and public finance is needed most probably for grants to help this one-stop shop, to provide information, to pre-qualify the contractor, to train the contractor, but then a private sector with loans or innovative finance. I was very pleased to see one of our graph in the slides presented early on, where you can have on bill, on tax, green mortgages. There are different instruments that needs to be explored. Second point, I agree very much that in this transition, we need to qualify the workforce. If we want to refurbish our building, we need a large amount of qualified workforce, which is not there, and make it available and ready to work. And it's not easy, but it has to be taken into account. We cannot say we refurbish 3% of our buildings if we don't have the skills and the work available to carry out this task. I entirely then agree that sometimes at building level is difficult. Look at this district and the neighborhood. Some building can host renewables, some cannot. Why not sharing the excess of heat or electricity among building, among maybe commercial places and private residential places? For example, if you have a data centers, why not reuse the waste heat? If you have a factory, the rejected heat should again be shared among the nearby buildings, whatever is available to optimize going beyond the building. Fully agree also on the life cycle and approach, moving away from energy to greenhouse gas as the denomination of energy performance certificates, of financial calculation. What we want is really to reduce the greenhouse gases. And finally, I want to also raise a point that if we build new buildings, they should be net zero carbon buildings. They should be smart, allowing for renewables, charging at the vehicles, storage, demand response, and integrate all of these technologies in the best manner to be really, I would say, sometimes even energy positive and might be neutral on greenhouse gases. Industry also a role to play and new technology as well. We hope that there will be more research also in technology which reduce the cost of new buildings, but also refurbishment. Prefabricated technology, 3D printing is very important, robots in constructions, this is very important. And finally, a last call on data. We are trying to help our colleague in Brussels, which are revising the EPBD, and they ask us data. How many rented apartment or buildings do we have in Europe? How many singles versus multifamilies? Simple question, but very difficult still to find data, solid data on buildings. And we know that there's a building observatories, but also there's the struggle. So there's a call for all sources, being public authority with the cadastre, being researchers, to share and collect data on performance of building, data on cost of renovation, data on the type of ownership. For example, multi-ownership in buildings, again, another barriers to renovation. And all this needs to be addressed. And finally, also to always understand that buildings are different, attitude of consumer are different. So also the regional or national flavor should be taken. A building solution that works in Finland does not work in south of Spain. So recognize also these different geographical characteristics of building, climate, citizen attitude, and societal difference. I would like to stop here and again congratulate you for putting together such a nice report and putting up this a very interesting conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paolo, for adding your perspective from your background to the report. Let's move on to Paul Kartuyvels from the European Construction Technology Platform. Paul is the director at Bouygues in Europe, and he represents the company in Brussels. Paul, may I invite you to take the floor?
Yes, thank you very much, Wim. So good afternoon to everybody, the more than 100 people participating to the seminar. Basically, of course, as the European Construction Technology Platform, I have to confirm that we are totally satisfied with this report. I think it is extremely complete. I tried to tick the boxes of the things I wanted to see, and I almost ticked everything. It was just very impressive on that side. But to say a few particular things, I must say that I was really pleased that your first chapter is on people. You have people up front. This is really important. You've done that right. I think it's really the priority, the quality of life, the health of the people. You've put it in your report, and that is excellent. I would add that it would be great to also do something that I would call the best before works. I mean, we know it's going to be complicated to renovate everything and the new buildings. And I think we should train and motivate not only the workers, we should train and motivate the occupants. And I mean, all of us here in our offices, in our houses, we should check what we can do to improve the situation before even €1 is being spent. That is important. Secondly, if I look at the report and I hear the speakers before me, I think we should really focus on renovation of individual housing. I say this because already now a lot of excellent solution exists for clustering renovation projects. We can do a lot of things. Large companies can train their workers. We have digital solutions to train workers that are impressive. In 3 minutes, I cannot tell you everything, but individual housing, that's the complex part, the non-clusterable renovation. That is complicated. And also small construction companies subcontracting to many people. And here I shift, I'm not anymore ECTP or Bouygues. I'm a citizen that has just finished deep retrofitting a building in a farm with my wife. And it was a nightmare. It was complicated. I don't see how you can train the workers. They speak 5 different languages. They come from different sources, and sometimes they do different work sites at the same time, so there are delays. So I'm glad to put the list of problems that I faced in my deep renovation project with my wife to tell you about really the concrete problems before saying only nice things. I'd be glad to share this information with you. And it's also for the health of the people. It's very stressing. So you don't sleep anymore. That's quality of life also. Otherwise, to come back to the subject, I concentrated also on regulation, which is probably the less exciting part because the rest is great. And many people talked about EPBD review coming next year. I would just remind all the people participating that there is a public consultation right now on the revision of EPBD open until June 22nd. So get on your job to propose things, and you should at ESAC send your report in the framework of this consultation. Finally, to conclude, this is my 3 minutes ringing. Taxonomy was mentioned, and this taxonomy is a complex thing. We have been talking about climate change mitigation here with CO2 reduction. The taxonomy, and there's someone from EIB, from the Commission, MEPs, insist that we work also on climate change adaptation, on water issues, on circular economy, you covered that, on pollution, health, pollution in indoor environment, you mentioned it also. Biodiversity. Let me just finish with one case. Soil sealing is becoming one political issue everywhere. And I can tell you that construction projects will be linked to new rules, and in particular, limiting soil sealing. The problems already happens now in France, we face it. We cannot artificialize the ground as we would like to. So you can have a positive energy building. If it's not built on the right ground, it's not gonna be financed in the same advantageous way. So remember that those common objectives from the Green Deal, going to biodiversity issues and soil sealing issues, have to be taken into account, and not only energy efficiency. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Thank you for your attention. Sorry for the 3 minutes. We should have taken a whole day. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for your perspective. I will certainly come back to you in the panel discussion, because there are quite a few questions in the Q&A that touch on basically your sector. How really do we get this done? How do we really get all the materials, the people, etc.? But I'll come back to that later. Let's move on to Mariangelo Fabbri from the Buildings Performance Institute Europe, an institute that has figured quite a lot in this in the working group and in the report. So I'm very happy that Mariangelo is joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for the invitation, and congratulations for the report. It's really comprehensive. It's had already been said. It summarizes in a very clear and compelling way the many challenges that we're all facing when it comes to decarbonizing the building sector, and it touches upon a multitude of technologies and policies that influence the building supply and value chain. And I think it highlights a great opportunity that we have to apply Europe's collective knowledge and brilliant minds, whether it's from a scientific point of view and legal, political, economic, at least a little bit less on the sociological elements, as it already been said, but all these knowledge is available to win the climate challenge. And today, it was difficult to choose which remark and where would I wanted to focus, but I've decided that I would like to focus on one point, which is the need to adjust and change the buildings industry to make sure that they're actually up to the task. Of course, they will not do it alone. I think many are of the opinion that this is not in the hands of the decision makers, and certainly not in the hands of DG Energy and Stefan and his team, and that given the right and correct price and market demand signals, the supply and the offer will automatically adjust very quickly. But we know that this is not going to happen. I think the buildings industry and the construction sector needs a little bit of nudging and a little bit of regulatory pushing, most likely. And the report highlights actually the right elements that actually need to be looked at also from that perspective, starting from showing the political commitment and will. And so this is a plea to DG Ener and the European Commission, who is going to review a plethora of regulations in the next year. This is the right moment to think about how all the measures that you've rightly highlighted can trigger the industry to adjust faster than they would naturally do. The second point, which is less highlighted in your report, you touch upon it, but it's absolutely essential, especially in view of the use of the next generation EU funding, is emboldening entrepreneurs and innovators to deliver these new comprehensive renovation solutions. I think the renovation is the biggest challenge that we're facing. And there are plenty of ideas that have been pilots that have proven right. We don't lack technologies. We do not lack knowledge. We just seem to lack a little bit of forceful implementation of all of this. And there's one point in particular that will change how we do renovation, which is offering a serial prefabrications and off-sites constructions and renovation solutions matched with the services that we can offer to the citizens to avoid the headaches and the stress that Paul mentioned before. And also in terms of competitiveness and innovation, Europe and European industry has the knowledge to do that. And I think the time is right. It's right from a climate perspective, but it's also right now. We think we should avoid waiting too long until someone from outside Europe comes with the brilliant idea and the disruptive market solution, the Tesla of the construction sector, and takes this opportunity away from us. And I think this is a very important element. And the last point, it's about changing the renovation journey. Paolo and others mentioned this, and Stefan as well, about making sure that we change the way we talk about renovation, but also that we offer renovation to everyone, including those that live in energy poverty and fuel poverty. There are plenty of instruments that can help us doing this: financial instruments, regulatory instruments, EPCs, building renovation passport, one-stop shops, you name it. It's just a matter of putting them together in a way that the industry is prepared to offer those services when the demand arises. But this preparation needs to start now. We cannot wait to see the demand, because otherwise we will not be able to deliver. And we were gonna miss a major opportunity. We have to triple our renovation rates. And so this is absolutely an essential point. One last point, gladly we saw you including the issue of embodied energy. We've recently started working on this topic. We debated a long time whether that was the right thing to do, or whether it would not complicate things. But it is an inevitable issue that we are going to face, and this is the right moment to make sure that we start looking into this topic, especially from a regulatory perspective. We have recently released a few recommendations of how that can be done. I'll be happy to share it with everyone if you're interested, or talk about it in the panel. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Mariangelo. Let's move on to Monica Frassoni from the European Alliance to Save Energy, an organization which she founded and of which she has been the president since 2010. And actually before that, she has also been a member of the European Parliament. And Monica is even joining us from Bike in Tuscany, I understand.
Yes, thank you very much. I am in a very unstable situation in terms of connection. So if you don't mind, I will not offer you the beautiful hills where I am now. I just wanted to thank you very much for this report and underline, as all the other speakers did, how important it is to have such a good base, not only for legislation, but also for conversation with policymakers and even with public opinion, etc. Because this is a question that, as a lot of other people said, needs to have the involvement of a very large, it's a really societal challenge. And really it needs a lot of involvement of understanding. So, and in order to understand, we need data, and we need some demonstrations that things are going in the right direction. And if they go in the right direction, solutions can be found in order to deal with climate change, but also to improve the quality of the place we live. Now, I have a couple of comments and then a couple of, and I have also a question. First, on the issue of the comment, I found the part that I found least convincing, let's start from that, is the part where you talk about CCS. I don't think that CCS is relevant for building, first of all. And secondly, I believe that you can really deal with deep renovation and having a lot of results in the next 10 years. I want to really underline this, without touching CCS. Not only because with CCS, at least this is my humble opinion, is basically non-existing yet. Is not, you cannot say that this is something that is existing that you can easily implement, but is also extremely expensive. You know, in the PNRR of Italy, my country, there were some voices that were, you know, trying to put in an investment on CCS, and this was 2.6 billion euro, which is huge. And I think that also this would really create some kind of misunderstanding on what is one of your main messages, and that is to get rid of dependence on fossil fuels. And technologies in terms of energy efficiency in buildings are there in order to make us get out of this dependency as quickly as possible. So I actually think that if you can talk about CCS for highly intensive industries, or for other parts of the economy, and you can certainly discuss about it, I am really not convinced that this is something that is useful in the conversation about buildings. We are also working on embodied energy. I was very interested by the comments done by Ralph, and maybe this is something that we need to go a little bit deep because it is a really important point. Also, I think, I mean, I didn't find in the report, although I didn't read it with, in all its part with a lot of details, a reference to the energy efficiency first principle, which is a very important and guiding principle of the European legislation, which I believe should be not only mentioned, but also measured in terms, evaluated in terms of the help that it can give to the holistic approach we are actually talking about, and this could be useful to be taken in. Also, I am of the opinion that probably the data on jobs that you mentioned, the 3.4, should be a little bit more clarified, because, for example, my data says that there are about 18 million people working in the building sector in Europe. Probably this is a very large and comprehensive estimation. I fully agree on the need to underline the fact that the Commission is probably too modest in calculating how many jobs this kind of the renovation wave can create, or the tripling of the renovation rate can create. But maybe it is important to clarify better, you know, these numbers that are done in this part, because it's really key. This is something that everybody is asking. You know, what is the impact on emissions, but also what is the impact on job and of creation of activity, and to have clear numbers is actually very important. Last point is the issue of the directive to be revised, and EPBD is certainly, of course, EED as well with the targets, etc. But EPBD is for us a unique opportunity to increase energy savings, but also to reduce emissions from the building sectors. And I am actually happy that a lot of topics that you deal with in the report are actually going to be very useful when substantiating our proposals to the legislative proposals. And indeed, we are also participating to the conversation and to the consultation. I don't know if I still have half a minute, because I didn't have I didn't count. I don't have here my watch with me.
Go ahead for your half a minute, Monica.
Okay, and there are very good concepts that I would like to underline in the report. One is a positive energy buildings. It's very useful. The building as infrastructure is a concept that we have been pushing for with not so much effort, with not so much success, at least in our conversation with policymakers. Very good that it's there. And of course, the building and system integration with industry and transport, thanks to digitalization, are also concepts that are very useful in the current debate, which is not simply, hey, let's build more efficient buildings, but it's much more than that. And I think that your report is really able to talk about this. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Monica, for joining us from Tuscany. Let's then finally move on to the last speaker in this lineup, Sergio Edwards from Housing Europe, which is an organization, the European Federation of Public, Cooperative and Social Housing, a network of 46 national and regional federations in 25 countries. And I'm sure that Sergio will come back to energy poverty and some of these issues also. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Wim. I hope that everybody can focus now and stop wishing they were all cycling in Tuscany. Thanks a lot to Monica for that. We owe you one. Yes, I would like to first thank you very much for involving us again. We spoke at the kickoff of this project, so happy to be joining in again now that you've wrapped up what seems to be a really useful report. A couple of reactions to the report. We see a lot of useful analysis information, good examples, and we notice quite a few of them come from our sector, so that's nice to see. We also welcome the fact that the policy recommendations are broadly speaking in line with what our sector has embarked on over the last few years, in particularly a stronger consideration of CO2 emissions, the different aspects of renovation and of the building and heating system. This is the holistic approach that we often get called for from our local organizations linked to our network, so the public, social and cooperative housing provider. It's this holistic approach that very often they see was missing in the past from the approach from the EU level. We do have the observation but it has come up a lot today, and I've already discussed it with Bill. So there is a lack of a focus on affordability that I think we can work further on as we also in the context of the review of the EPBD. And so the affordability of living and the very often even policy choices we see from our members, that they have to balance the need for new construction and the need for renovation. So and I think it is important, it might not be directly part of our conversation today, but it is important to put it in the context of the current housing reality and the current housing inequalities we're seeing. And particularly, this has been even more in focus because of the pandemic, as people have been forced to spend more time at home with obvious implications for the energy consumption and needs. And we see, unfortunately, growing inequalities there in that sphere. I would like to also, from the discussion today, very much welcome Paolo Bertoldi's intervention and the stress, I think, on the very different strategies that are needed in different regions with different citizens approach, different climate, different housing typologies. And I think this, if we are really to bring an added value from EU level, this has to be the starting point. This recognition that diversity is there, and there is no blanket approach that can bring that can work from an EU level. And I think also Brian Norton's observation that there is also no silver bullet. And this is the constant message we get when we talk to our members, whether that is public housing providers in Portugal, whether that is non-profit social housing providers in Amsterdam, whether that are Swiss housing cooperatives. It's really that they are not looking to EU level to find out how they should approach their housing stock. It's not our role. I think the role from EU level, how we can add value, is to set the targets, but give and then focus on capacity building measures so that the best approach can be found at local, regional, national level. And I think that is going to be crucial when we look at the review of the legislation as well. What we really see is that policies, they should set objectives, but enable the different sectors to reach those objectives. So really focusing as much on the carrot as on the sticks. We do not think that policies which prescribe a particular path towards those objectives, but will help, but we should help local communities build on the local social, economic, and energy resources so they can set up their own successful strategies. I think that is the real message that we get from our members. They don't want to be dictated to, but they want the right incentives, finance, and targets in place, and the enabling information, knowledge, so that they can build up their optimal strategy, whether that is at neighborhood level and at district level. And yeah, just a point from our sector. So as you know, we are not organizations that are completely focused on energy. These are organizations, there are 46,000 of those around Europe, managing around 25 million units, delivering another 200,000 every year, renovating also around 200,000 every year, investing approximately 50 million euro every year. They have the ambition to, and they estimate that they can renovate 4 million units by 2030. So that is the forecast. I must say it is still pre-pandemic, but that is the forecast that we have extracted from the planning of the different housing providers at local and national level. So it definitely, I think they definitely see themselves as having a key role to play and a leadership role to play. Although, of course, in consideration of the multiple pressures they have, in terms of social obligations. And this is what we are very happy to work over the next months with Stefan Moser, with the European Parliament, to figure out a way on how we can really optimize the legislation so that it enables ongoing progress in our sector, so that the sector really can be a flagship for what we need, and that is a just and fair energy transition. And I think we can see we constantly update our Housing Evolutions Hub with examples of where those good practices are really happening on the ground. We see examples from Kortrijk to Aalborg to Brussels to Bordeaux, with clear results around CO2 reductions, on clear results around energy savings, but crucially also clear results around turning areas into places that remain affordable, places that people can be proud to live in. So that requires an integrated approach, looking at also the green areas and the quality of life. And the last point there, I think we got good recognition of that. It was mentioned today as well by Bill. This focus indeed on reducing CO2 emissions by really reducing the amount of demolition and really focusing on optimal renovation. And we see the recognition, for example, on the Grand Park project in Bordeaux, which recently won the Pritzker Prize for architecture. I think these type of examples, which was also highlighted by Ursula von der Leyen in the launch of the new Bauhaus, European Bauhaus, these sort of initiatives coming from the social affordable housing sector, I think, can really help to show us the way, also for the broader built environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sorcha. Thanks to all the speakers for their contributions and responses. Overall, I think I can speak on behalf of Brian and Bill that we're very happy with the positive reception of the report, although there have, of course, also quite a few additional points of attention being mentioned. We have little time left because we do want to close at 2, and Maria da Gracia Carvalho was already on the screen. A member of European Parliament has accepted our invitation to have the closing remarks, and I want to give her the floor at 10 to 2. So I would propose that we take up 2 issues that have been mentioned and that have also been mentioned in the Q&A. One being, do we really have the materials and the people, and shouldn't we, if I use the words of Mariangelo, shouldn't the building sector be nudged to work harder towards the transition? And secondly, the point of embodied emissions was also mentioned by several of the speakers as an important point, and Ralph mentioned that he had maybe some doubts about that. So I would propose that maybe I can invite Paul to reflect on some of these questions that have come up in the Q&A, where some people who, at least I read their responses or their questions as being quite favorable to our goals, but saying we just don't have the materials, we don't have the people making or doing all these renovations. And actually some of the question, there was also a question of someone saying, well, yes, renovation is fine, but there are also quite a few member states where we still need to build a large number of houses for the people that don't have sufficient housing now. Could you reflect on how we make this transition and where you should be nudged by the people from BPIE and others?
Thank you, Wim. First of all, on the materials, I do agree with the fact that starting to calculate embodied energy makes things complicated, but it's an exercise that we have to try to go through. And in the construction sector, we have already started trying our best to do so. Not to forget transport issues of those materials and the distance, because the examples of prefabrication that have been mentioned before are interesting cases where we would even build a factory near the work site to make sure we can prefabricate on spot. So disembodied energy is an issue, but then we should use it everywhere, in the sense that we have not mentioned the embodied energy in energy infrastructure. So, okay, we talk a lot about renewable energy, but what's the embodied energy of building the solar panels, the solar farms, the wind farms, and all those things? So life cycle assessment is a good approach, but then it has to be applied everywhere, not in certain cases. Otherwise, it's not fair. For the people, well, I just mentioned to you through the private example, I think that the people are there, but it is complicated because the construction workers, even if there are many in Europe, they work already almost full-time. We have to take into consideration the complications that arrived during the past 1.5 years also. So delays are everywhere. It has become complicated to fix things. We should train more people, definitely. I would insist maybe on one point that was mentioned, but can be mentioned even more, is the potential of digital solutions in construction. And we really have to use it already for materials. I saw quickly the questions also. There's a question on saving concrete. Absolutely. If we do building information modeling of buildings, we can save, we estimate about 1/3 of the materials by planning things all right, by planning the construction all right. So digital solutions are really important and they are used quite a lot in the construction sector, to the contrary of what some consultants like to say. They like to say that the construction sector is not digital. I don't think it's true. It depends on where you've taken your statistics, which is very dangerous. So I would encourage the Commission and EIB and others to look at construction as a great sector for digital solutions. It's really great. So yes, the materials, it's really a problem. How many people here are aware that sand can be a problem? That's things that we don't realize. Sand can be a problem. For wood, wood has been mentioned here. It's been a couple of years now that we really concentrate at Bouygues on wood construction. We try to do our best because I think we think it's indeed an interesting solution. Who could foresee that during the past year, demand for wood in Europe from the outside would raise so much that the price of wood increased dramatically? So the price of wood is not the same anymore in a few months. So all the business models based on woods have to be revised. All those things you cannot foresee. So I think we should look at all solutions. We should really remain open and make sure that we check on everything and expect some surprises. When I say external demand, it means that Europe is not a closed market. And we also know that EIB, for instance, works around the world, especially in developing countries, things like this. So all the model regulation that we produce in Europe ends up being copied or applied in other places. So let's be very open in terms of also these connections with the outside world.
Thank you, Paul. Does anyone of the panel members want to react to this? In particular, maybe the embodied emissions, which was a topic which was taken up by several of the speakers. In particular, Ralph was a bit hesitant, if I remember.
Well, I hope you can hear me.
Sure.
Good, because I changed to another system here. So yeah, my point on embodied emission was not neglecting that this is an issue and that we should look at it. The point I want to make is, where do we tackle this issue? And I'm looking at when we work with intermediate banks and with municipalities and with project promoters, we already see now that there are difficulties in gathering data on the operational emissions, and there's a reluctancy in the private sector to go into these detailed data mining. My point is that this should be tackled by regulation more than on an individual project base. So you can tackle this in regulation if you limit this embodied energy content of different building materials, which gives an incentive to industry to innovate, or that you have sector-specific targets for that. But looking that on a project level will become relatively difficult, and we should not try to blur the message also to the final investment decision, because people are already struggling to understand, and this is why we welcome to go for final energy, because they struggle to understand their energy performance certificate and to struggle to see what is primary, what is that. They have no clue, but they know what they pay, and that's directly related to their final energy consumption. If we then add discussions on embodied energy on any type of certificate, this will become probably difficult. So we have to have a clear message, and we have to see at which point we can tackle the embodied emissions. But I'm fully with you that for sure we have to look at this, especially for new construction, but also in the assessment. If we look at planning authorities to allow demolition versus renovation, because there you should make these calculations and put this in the planning process, but probably difficult to leave this to individuals or small homeowner associations to understand that one, where there's already difficulty to differentiate between kilowatt and kilowatt hours, not speaking of anything more. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. Does anyone want to?
This is Paolo Bertoldi.
Yes, Paolo.
Maybe just a comment. I agree with Ralph. And one point that was not raised in discussion today is carbon pricing. That must be much more evident in the choice we make, including the materials we use. So only this can really shift to a life cycle approach. When we see that the steel or the steel with high greenhouse gas embedded or the cement are becoming expensive because the carbon price that this company have to pay or is translated basically from the producer somehow to the end user, and this is made explicit. We do this already for energy, but we are very reluctant yet to do for materials, and this is very important because we recognize materials are as important as energy use. So for me, one additional recommendation perhaps is to make explicit the carbon content and associate this carbon content with a clear taxation or price that consumer will see. And then things will change in my view. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Paolo. Mariangelo, you would also like to contribute.
Yes, thank you. As I mentioned before, BPIE has been debating internally for a while about the opportunity to open up the conversation about embodied carbon, but I think the fact that it poses specific challenges is not a reason to shy away from the topic. And I agree with Ralph. I think the right starting point is not the project, it's more in regulations, and that's how we looked at it. We looked at it how can we tackle these issues in the European regulations, and the first landing point that we had was, what is the regulation that is out there? What does the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive say about it or doesn't say about it, and what do we need to start that conversation and to make sure that there is a place for the carbon metrics next to a place for the operational energy metrics. We have not found a specific solution that solves every problem, but I think this is the right moment to start having these discussions and these conversations, and there are opportunities out there on how to do it in an effective way.
Thank you. I guess given the time, just before I give the floor to Maria de Gracia Carvalho to give a few closing remarks, I'm looking at Bill and Brian, whether they can, since so many contributions have been made, and of course, I'm not inviting you for a long speech, but I would like to give you the opportunity to reflect briefly on all the comments you've had to the report.
Yes, Vim, it's difficult to give a short speech on this, but I'll try. I mean, first of all, can I thank everyone for their contributions? I think one of the whole points of the report is to stimulate an evidence-based debate, and certainly that is what we're seeing here. And the important thing is there are steps taken to move forward with the agenda. And for example, with the embodied energy, I think the report is agnostic as to how we take it forward, but it's important it is taken forward, and taken forward both in the context of new build and renovation, and not just perhaps in terms of just the embodied energy that is in materials, but the design choices that can be made to reduce embodied energy. So I think there are those there. And I just pick up a point on carbon capture and storage, where it comes in the report is actually in the continued use of gas. And if we are going to have continued use of gas in networks, to decarbonize that will require carbon capture and storage, but that would need to be evaluated with all those costs and feasibility included against straightforward electrification options. So I think it's again that comment is understood, and certainly the report would be advocating that as a primary route. But if there was a persistence of gas, it would need to be an important part of a strategy around that as well. There are many other things. Don't think we have time, but can I thank everyone for their comments?
Thank you very much, Brian. And indeed, I also value very much all the contributions that have been made and the responses. And indeed, as Brian is saying, this is in a way a first step. It's not a final report in a way. I mean, the ESEC report hopefully will promote further discussion and actually taking this whole issue forward. And I was at least very happy to see the consensus, how important this is. May I now invite Maria de Carvalho to take the floor, and we're always very honored when she's joining us. She has been involved with ESEC and some of our work before. Maria is a present member of parliament, but she has also been so in the past, and she has been a principal advisor to President Barroso. And in Portugal in the past, she has also been a minister for science and higher education. So we feel very lucky to have her give the closing remarks. Maria.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind words. And I'd like to thank in general EASAC and to give the congratulations for the fantastic work. And also a special word for William Gillet, that I know for a long time from my past work in the EASAC. The ones that know me well know that I have been pushing where I am in being minister or in the European Commission for science advice. And in my closing remarks, I would like to touch this as the first point, the importance of scientific advice and the science-based policy choices. And the second point is to say some words about the recommendations, but put mainly on the emphasis on the points that I would like in the future you could elaborate it more. I'm sorry, I'm a professor. I'm a professor on energy and climate change. I still hold my position, not at the moment giving classes, but in the University of Lisbon, and I always look at the reports with an academic eye, how it can be future work, future ideas. So starting with the first topic, I always defend that science advice should be embedded in all levels of the decision-making process. And scientific advice should be independent and autonomous and not influenced by political, economic bodies or authorities. The role of economic and political bodies, it's important, but at a different stage. I always defend that we need to have the completely independent science advice based on the best available knowledge from the independent scientists. We should have the ethical principles if the matter has the ethical implications, and after there is the political decision, taking into consideration these two information and taking other questions into account, like the political and economic environment, but that is at a different level, and that this political decision should be transparent and should say why, in the case they don't really follow the independent scientific advice, why is that, what is the reasons. Is the way I think that in modern times policymakers should act, and the scientific advice is really at the center of the policymaker. And I take the opportunity to congratulate EASAC and all the science academies that have done through the years fantastic work, providing exactly independent science advice to policymakers. I was the principal advisor of President Barroso that advised him that he need to have a independent chief scientific advisor, and after also that I was involved in the design of the existing science advice mechanism that was with after with the Commissioner Wenders. So I'm very proud of that this legacy that I have been pushing inside the European Commission. The scientific advice mechanism that ESAC also contributes, and is also part of this mechanism. But let's pass to my second point, and this is an example of science advice. The present report is I read the report, not with a lot of detail as I would like, but I found it very interesting, quite complete, and I also enjoy very much the debate today. And the first point that I would like to stress is that I'm completely convinced that the policymakers should bet on the renovation, rehabilitation, and the restoration of buildings as the first priority in the recovery plan. I also have defended that in 2007, 2008. I don't know, for the ones that were around, there was already a recovery plan from that time, the financial crisis. At the time I was principal advisor in the Commission. Unfortunately, the solution, we had two plans on the table. One was renovation of buildings. The other one was 7 large projects on CCS. And the Commission in the end chose the 7 CCS projects. And unfortunately, none of the projects arrived until the end because the technology was not mature enough. And I listened to Monica Frassoni always with a lot of interest, and there I agree with her. The CCS has not the same level as the renovation of buildings. I disagree with her because I'm a defender on CCS on certain conditions for energy-intensive industries. But also we need to have more research and development and demonstration to have this technology ready. But we should not mix that discussion with the energy efficient in buildings. Energy efficient in buildings is ready to act now. Is the best value for money that the politicians have at this moment, because as it has a huge impact on the reducing the greenhouse gas, but also have a series of secondary positive effects, like a better environment in the neighborhood, reducing the crime, giving a better positive effects on tourism, on the social well-being of people, on the air quality, on the whole environment of the city. So, and the jobs, it's a very intensive on jobs and local jobs. So in the times of recovery that we are now, for example, for the decisions of the Recovery and Resilience Plan, I would say, even if we don't take in consideration energy, if we take in consideration all the fields, I think these fields should be the #1 for the recovery. So I share many recommendations and many things that were said today. I would probably would stress a better link between the climate change with other policies. And one that I always defend is with the air quality. The buildings pose severe questions of air quality, and there is now recent research about this, and with quite bad impact on health from NO2 to particle matter to volatile organic compounds, So a better link between your work and the air quality will be interest for the future. Also, a better link with the water strategies. On the circular economy you have done, but I think that this more holistic way to look at the different policies will be very important. A second point that I also think that will be good to tackle in more detail is to look at the building not as an isolated element, but as a part of the urban environment. So all the location of the building, the exposure, the fluid flow around the building, the radiation, and there are already fantastic modeling, complex modeling for optimization of the buildings and of the neighborhood, I would say. And that is quite interesting. Something that was, I think that was Paul that mentioned, and that I also think that is not, is a big barrier, is the complexity. You mentioned the complexity with the skills, the workers that speak a different language, but there is also another complex, especially in my country, is the administrative complexity. The paperwork that is necessary is a nightmare. And there are buildings that is not even possible because there is old buildings that people that have died, they have a lot of people that they have inherited, is not solved. So if we go, the city that I live now, Lisbon, if you walk around Lisbon, you say that the buildings that are not renovated are probably the ones that have complexes of this kind. So we need to have some sort of way, and the whole building cannot be renovated because there is one part that has a legal problem that is sometimes not, there is no solution. And it's something that we should have a scheme. I know that we need to protect the private property, but to have some kind of solution for this complexity that is. And this also relates with the social question. And it's not only a question of the investment, that is very important to have the investment, but it's much more than that. It's all this nightmare of complexity. And the modernization of the construction industry, there are fantastic examples, but we have to look, Europe is very large, and we have to look at the small companies everywhere in Europe, and still there are a lot to be done on the modernization of the industry. And a point that I always think that is crucial is involving the citizens and give basic skills to the citizens, that they do themselves small things like, and there are a kind of shops like supermarkets where you can get the basic equipment and the basic materials that can you do it yourself. Like you have that for other areas. I don't. For other sectors, I don't want to mention, not to be to make publicity, but that you can go and buy, and you have the instructions how you can have your house or your office much more energy efficient. Because people would do it, but they don't know how to do it. They don't know where to buy. They are a bit afraid of the complexity of having work done from third parties in their house. So I think this involvement of citizens will be very important. My last point is, I would like to have seen in the report what is missing in terms of science, research, and demonstration. I know that usually we don't mix science for policy and policy for science, but if you don't have the full knowledge of a certain subject, you cannot do proper science for policy. So in certain way, even in the science for policy, you may include a chapter saying, okay, to do independent scientific advice. We still would like to have more science development in these areas. So this is my suggestion, to keep ESAC going in the probably in the next report. Some suggestions with a lot of modesty that I'm just doing for you, but congratulations for the great work that is very useful for the policymakers. And it's with these kind of reports that we will be able to face the challenge that we have in front of us, from climate change, air pollution, and at the same time to keep our economy, our industry, and all the technological revolution that we want to keep Europe competitive. So thank you very much for all the work that you have done. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank in particular also all the other panel members, and in particular also Maria de Gracia Carvalho for her final remarks. ESAC reports typically play an important role for several years in the public debate, in particular in Europe. And given the remarks that have been made that say that this is such a comprehensive report, and of course everyone has additional points that we should pay more attention to and that will figure in the debate. From the remarks that have been made, I'm sure that this report will be an important reference frame in future discussions, and we will certainly be are looking forward to further exchanges with all the organizations here on board and on the screen, and also with the people from the participants who also represent other organizations. I really would like to thank you for your attention and for your contributions, and we hope to see you all back at other occasions in the near future. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Very interesting.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.